welcome to the session. It's really my pleasure to be here with you and to spend some time talking about ethics and leadership in times of chaos. I like to use a lot of images, and so I start with these two. These are two pictures from Banda Aceh area following the tsunami. I was asked to go into Indonesia following the tsunami and to assess the conditions and set up the Canadian Red Cross recovery program there. And I could go for 6 months, and I stayed for 2 years. So this is armchair travel to a disaster zone, but to look at it through a certain lens. So in doing that, though, I start with these two pictures, and so what I'd like you to do is look at the picture on the left and think of a word that describes that for you and throw that out to me. What's a word that describes that image? Serenity. Tranquil.
Paradise.
Yes, it is paradise. And the picture on the right, what's a word that you'd use to describe that?
Chaos.
Disaster.
Chaos, disaster, tragedy, destruction. So what's interesting is they are two scenes of the disaster. They are both the effects of the disaster. The difference is that more has been lost in the picture on the left. So imagine taking your hand and wiping it across the community. What's left, those are the foundations of homes, and everything is gone. So there are different images of a disaster, and we can think about that place in different ways, and we respond. And so we're going to talk about what some of those thoughts are about the pictures from this place. When we think about the tsunami, or if we think about Haiti, it is a catastrophic disaster, and the Government of Canada actually has a little formula for figuring out what a catastrophic disaster is and classifying it, and that really then says, okay, we're going to do these things in response. So this is just a table that tells you about it, but it means greater than 2 million people affected. But if you take a look under infrastructure and see what happens, that you've lost health and water infrastructure, you've lost roads usually, but if you look at shelter, you have greater than 40% of the shelter that has been lost. If you were to use this definition of catastrophe and think about what had happened in Haiti, it would fit. So there's certain types of disasters that will be classed as catastrophe. It's really about size and magnitude. Tsunami was one of those. So I go into this place and need to make sense of it. And so I'm going to speak to you tonight about the leadership challenge in that context and how I had to make sense of it. First was to say, what's going on here? What are the demands and what needs to be done? And in there, I'm going to talk about perspectives on time and how that influences your thinking. I'm going to speak a bit about values-based decision-making as a way to make sense through that context and to make decisions and look at what the cost is of choice and who pays. And one of the things I come away with from that experience is I believe in the impossible now. I believe that you can go into an environment that has been so totally destroyed and rebuild it. And we face challenges in our lives and say, you know, we can't surmount them, but we can. It's the way we think about it. It is really what we have in our brains that allows us to make these choices. So I was interviewed following the earthquake in Haiti by a reporter, and she said, so what do you think about is possible in Haiti? And I said, I believe that what we can do in Haiti is something different. The knowledge is there now to do that. It's whether we have the will and can connect the dots. So I'm going to take you on a journey of some imagery about the disaster and its impact before telling you about what we were doing and the decisions we had to make. Before and after, this is a section of Banda Aceh. So you can imagine what has happened, not only to the infrastructure, to the housing, to the roads, but also to the people that were living there. In many communities, 80 or 90% of the people living there were killed. In our lives, we usually lose people one at a time, but if you imagine losing 80 or 90% of your relatives at once, what that is, it's a very different impact. That kind of devastation occurred over 1,000 kilometers of coastline. There was a significant loss of life. The Indonesian Red Cross had actually been present there for some time, and there'd been a conflict in this area before the tsunami, And they used to carry bodies out of the hills whenever there was a skirmish and repatriate the remains. And so they repatriated remains following the tsunami. And then there were signs put up by the ICRC of people who were missing. And one of the most important things in a disaster like this is to bring some closure and to actually find a body. And so that's a challenge with the whole concept of mass graves when you think about what's going on in Haiti. Lots of destruction, and when we think about Indonesia, sometimes we don't know what kind of housing it is. This picture on the left is of a typical house. It's a little tilted at the moment, knocked by both the earthquake and the waves, I think. But a fairly sturdy house. And so that was the kind of housing that you'd see around Banda Aceh. And yet people were then forced to live in tents, and 550,000 people were displaced. Not all the housing was like that, and I'll show you some other images. 9 months after the disaster, there were still that many people living in tents. People lost their livelihoods, their means to support themselves, and so we can look at the boats destroyed or the schools or hospitals destroyed, but in addition to the 2,135 schools destroyed, 1,000 school teachers lost their lives. So we tend to classify or think, or the imagery of disaster is always about the hard part, and we often forget that there is that other side. So if a school is destroyed, it's not just about rebuilding the school, it's about ensuring you've got somebody to teach in that school and that you have children to attend the school. Lots of the roads were destroyed. There's the picture on the left, there's 2 dots in the water, if you can see that, and there's a road off to the left, and that road used to go out over where the sea is now, and so that whole west coast side, the road was completely destroyed, and so it was impossible to get out there. To go a distance of about 150 kilometers took 2 days on the temporary road, and then when conditions improved a little bit, you could do it in a day. So if you think about trying to make progress, even just to get out to a site, much less to take goods out to a site, became very difficult. This is one of the temporary bridges that was put in that collapsed under the use of, with trucks carrying material. In total, 654 villages were destroyed, and so think of that, just taking again your hand and wiping them off the map. Knowing a bit about the context, we need to know a bit more about Aceh. It is a Muslim country, and so religion was very much part of the place there. We needed to consider both religious law as well as Indonesian law in making decisions about inheritance, for example, in terms of who would get a house, respecting inheritance rights. But there had also been a conflict there that had been going on for 30 years, and most people don't know about that conflict. And over 30,000 people had been killed. And there'd been many attempts at peace accords, and none had ever held until the tsunami. And another peace accord came, and it held. I was on the airplane on the day that the political prisoners who'd been detained for many years were released and were making their way back to Banda Aceh. One of the few non-prisoners on the plane. They were using commercial aircraft. And I realized what this was. They were all dressed the same plaid shirts, same jeans, same shoes. They'd just been let out of prison and they were on their way back. And so I saw them reunite with their families who were standing at the airport. So I realized I was a witness to the peace process as well here. But it also meant that people would be returning from conflict areas and reintegrating into communities that had been impacted by disaster. And that not only were you needing to rebuild for people who had been impacted by the tsunami, but you needed to consider this dynamic and this change that was occurring in the community at the same time. 3 months later, there was another earthquake. Most people haven't heard about this one. It was on the island of Nias. Picture on the left shows you coral. That coral used to be under the sea. So what happened in this earthquake is it tilted. One end of the island went down, the other end went up. And this is the end that went up. The port collapsed. There is no water in the port, so even if you can fix the port, it doesn't really matter because you don't have water there anymore. So what happens to people's economy then? But the other thing about Nias was that it's been an area that's been neglected by the central government, and people are living in poverty. And so one of the questions is this earthquake damage in the picture on the right, or is this substandard housing? And how do you tell the difference? So I was with a team of engineers standing at this house, and we went to house after house that looked like this, trying to make that determination. How do you decide who you're going to give assistance to and who you're not going to give assistance to, and on what criteria? Just another picture from Nias, again, in terms of showing how people survive there. One of the products they produce is rubber. That's rubber. They take it from the trees. They don't have access to roads in many places, so they float it down the river. They connect to a road, and they're at the mercy of whoever comes to buy. So they don't have access to market. The market comes to them. And again, roads damaged. So one of the things we were able to do in that context was really to advocate for the roads and bridges to be improved, which would help the entire economy in that area. This is housing in Nias, so it contrasts significantly to the housing in Aceh. The pictures on the bottom are temporary housing that was constructed after the disaster. The pictures on the top are permanent housing. And there's not a lot of difference. This is a kitchen in Nias. So you have a bit of metal and a fire, and this is inside a house, and the house is wood. And these are some children looking out of their house. They were gracious enough to take us around, and again, we had to try and assess their house and determine what was earthquake damage and how we might assist them. And very complex, clearly quite substandard housing by our standards, but yet this was their home. And so in Canada, Canadian Red Cross, where I was working, had raised $372 million. CETA had made a large contribution to that. And so we had funds. The issue this time was not about not having the funding, it was about what was the correct way to spend the funding in that context. So the intent after going in and looking at this, it was clear that one of the major projects that needed to be done was related to ensuring people had a place to live. And so the primary focus of the program was to ensure that people have improved living conditions through access to safe and permanent houses and to secure land tenure, something that had not existed there before, and that we had strengthened the communities in this process through our consideration of the approaches that we had used. So doing that, we need to look at shelter through all of its various forms, from providing tents, first by providing tarp, by providing tents. The center picture is a transitional house, and the picture on the right is one of the final houses that the British Red Cross built. So the demands then in this context that you had to deal with, there were lots of perspectives on the time to rebuild, and behind those perspectives were different values. The beneficiaries needed shelter immediately, and they needed both temporary shelter and permanent shelter. Communities, some were wiped off the map and some didn't exist anymore. The sea was where their community used to be. So some needed land in order to rebuild. The government of Indonesia said everything would be rebuilt in 2 years. Guarantee. Government of Indonesia was not known for keeping its promises, but it was a statement about what was going to be done in that context, and they were playing the leadership role. CETA, Government of Canada, who'd given us funding, had said 4 years, and I have to commend the Government of Canada. We have to be really proud. One of the few governments in the world that allowed a longer time span for proper reconstruction to be done. Lots of times there's a 1-year window or 2-year window, but especially that 1-year window, there's this demand, let's see some immediate progress on the ground, and what that encourages is what we call humanitarian dumping. You spend money to get something done and it's not the right thing. So I'm not negating that there isn't a lot that needs to be done at the front end, but that pressure to do that can cause problems. And the media was very gracious in covering what we were doing, but there was a lot of coverage at the first anniversary about whether or not a house had been built. In fact, I was on CBC, and if you watched, you would have heard me say not a single permanent house had been built, but yes, we had lots of transitional shelters and other things in the works on the ground. And so there was this fixation with a certain type of progress that just didn't make sense. And if you were to say that you'd done that, I can't imagine what kind of, I have seen the kind of housing that would represent. So the challenge from a leadership perspective was around keeping focus, and my focus was on the long term. I wanted to think that Canadians gave money to make a difference and to make a long-term difference that we would be proud of, and that people there would have a lasting benefit and that they would be safe from future disasters. So it was about building back better in that context. And I had to stay focused on that. I lost staff along the way who wanted to do something quick, who felt we weren't doing enough, who were onto the we need to do it immediately. But we stayed focused, and I'll show you what the results were. So some ethical considerations, lots of different dilemmas in this context. I'm not going to go into them all, but you know, a key principle in a disaster context is do no harm. Every piece of humanitarian assistance is provided. There is both positive and negative impact, and what we want to do is reduce the negative impact. We need to look at the rights, whose rights, and how do we determine. We needed to consider both customary law and religious law and community tradition and understand how to mix those together. How do we treat people who are who have been part of the conflict versus part of the disaster when the funding is dedicated only to those who are for the disaster? What do we do when we've got substandard housing that's clearly going to fall down in the next earthquake, and yet we have somebody who has lost their house side by side? What decisions do we need to make? And I can go on and on through that. So those were the challenges that we had to grapple with. And there is no answer to one of those questions that will guide you. So what we did is we worked as a management team in setting up what we called value drivers to guide the decision-making process. And so a group of us sat in a room for one day. We don't have a lot of time there. And we hashed it out from our various perspectives. We had diverse points of view. And we came up with this list of value drivers, including the ranking of them. What was interesting for me is that we had people from our board of management come down a year later to see what had happened on the ground. And I did an exercise with them where I took all these value drivers, cut off the bits about the ranking, mixed them all up and said, rank those for me in terms of what you think is most important for us to do in this context. And except for one item, we had the list the same. So I think that was a good reflection of our ability to understand the values that we were understanding should be represented back from here from Canada and taking it into the context. So I'm going to run through quickly a few examples of the use of this value drivers in decision making. So again, the first piece was about delivering quickly. People wanted us to have housing immediately, but the first piece for us was satisfying beneficiary needs. And if we built a permanent house quickly, there was a cost to that, and there were different people who would pay for that cost. What was most important was satisfying beneficiary need. Picture on the bottom right with the blue sky is a house that was proposed by IOM, International Organization of Migration. We'd done work with them before following Hurricane Mitch. And it's think of it as a Lego house. You can build it in parts. It's sort of a prefab piece. The intent was that somebody could build it as a temporary house and then they could move it later to their permanent land. So good concept. But when you talk to the beneficiaries, they all said no. It's a transitional house. It's not a permanent house. And the walls on it were, if you've ever done renovating, I have, you're doing a bathroom, you use a different kind of, you don't use gyprock, you use a different kind of board, more cement board in the bathroom because you don't want the water to go through. Well, this was like that same kind of board, cement board, but about 3/8 inch thick. So I envisioned, I'm thinking 10 years down the line, what is this going to look like? I think a foot's going to go through that wall. And it's held together with these little nuts and bolts. And this is a humid environment. And I'm just imagining things collapsing. Now, you know, the engineers have said it is safe and it is stable. But we had questions. Community had questions. We had a $30 million deal on the table with IOM. We gave them the feedback. To their credit, they went back and redesigned it. But it wasn't satisfying the beneficiary need. And we dropped it. What we did do was use an architect and sat down with people and asked them about what was important about a house. And an Achenese house has a certain style. It has a multiple roof line. Picture on the top left is the drawing of the house that we created. We gave 4 options, and then the house in its various stages of being developed. We built a house that met the need in that context that was local. One of the things that happens following earthquakes is housing gets built and people don't live in it, time after time after time, again and again around the world. Why? Beneficiaries weren't consulted. Somebody made a decision, somebody needed to build something quickly. Another principle, an example, is achieve sustainable development. On the island of Nias, we needed to build homes from timber. Any timber that you're going to buy in bulk in Indonesia is going to come from an illegal logging source. We checked that out. You can get a certificate, but our environmental manager could circle all of the things on the certificate that were fraudulent. So Indonesia ranked 4th in terms of corruption. So attention to those things was important. So if you buy local timber that is from an illegal source, you're contributing to deforestation. That results in a landslide. That is another disaster. And so thinking not only about the disaster that we're working in, but trying to mitigate against future disasters was important. So in Aceh, we minimized the use of wood. We used steel. We started off using bricks, but bricks also use wood to burn to make them in outdoor kilns. So we moved to a block. So we minimized the impact on the environment in every way that we could, and at the same time, reduced future disaster risk and preserved that environment. We also looked after the tigers and elephants that were in the way, and so sometimes we had to build in different places so that we didn't disturb them, but that's a different story. Satisfying beneficiary needs, achieving sustainable development, and satisfying the community. Again, back on the island of Nias, people live in the woods. They're back 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kilometers in the woods. They're not all along the coastline. And so one of the challenges in this context, as I said, is people lived in substandard housing. The criteria for funding was to help people who'd been impacted by the disaster. How do you make a choice? You can't even tell which house has been impacted. The other thing about this place was that there was very little water or sanitation there. So lots of challenges and illness and disease because of the lack of clean water. So what we did is we actually provided improved water and sanitation to all communities we worked in, to every household. So there was a benefit to the entire community. And we rebuilt certain houses. And in choosing which houses were rebuilt, we again worked with local committees who worked with us on the criteria and who validated the lists. You still have to work and be attentive to issues of fraud and power and dynamics in those situations, but we were effectively able to do this. It was a version of the transitional shelter that was used in Aceh. In this case, think IKEA kit house. These houses in many cases had to be built 3 kilometers back in the woods on a path, and it was all carried by people living there. So you've got to package these kit houses in sizes and weights that people can actually carry. We also wanted to reduce future disaster risk and minimize risk just in a range of different ways. The top picture is of a community that there's little white dots on that peninsula, and those are foundations of homes. And the 3 red circles are the areas where the new developments will go in. So we worked with communities to actually do the land use planning. Here you'd have a planning department. There is no planning department. So when you rebuild, you're the planner as well. And you're also the person who does all the inspection on all of that, because nobody's there to do that. So you have to have 3 and 4 people deep inspecting. So what we did is we relocated people to settlements. We relocated them to land that they wanted to move to. One of the challenges was that the government would give them land, and it wasn't suitable land. And finally, after about a year and a half, the government finally admitted that 40% of the land that had been offered was not suitable, and there was some other reason behind it why that land was there. So again, it goes back to the corruption that existed in the environment. So we pressed on. We actually had to hire a land specialist to help us through this. It took 2 years to find land for all of those communities who didn't have a home. So if somebody asked me, why isn't there a home? Well, we don't have land to build the home. So reducing future disaster risk with the house design. We did geotechnical assessments so that we were wanting to know where the high spring tide was. The landscape had changed. What high tide area was not the same as it had been, so trying to figure that out. And then we built the foundations of these homes a certain amount above that. So just dealing with normal day-to-day flooding risk, we were taking care of that as well. Ensuring that the houses were built to the proper earthquake standard. I actually was not comfortable knowing that we just had a local team tell us that, so we actually sent that out of country to get it verified. Again, making sure that the design of the home was something that would stand. So those are a few examples of using values-based decision making. We went out to tender. We worked with a construction management company in Aceh and worked with contractors. The contracts were all awarded using values-based criteria. The same criteria you saw was how we awarded a contract. It was not about lowest cost. So it was applying those values to all aspects of the operation. You can do it. So a very special day for me was June 12th this last year, because I got this email from my colleagues in Ottawa who said that the Indonesian office had called to announce that the last 5 houses had been completed. 5,580 houses were completed and handed over to the beneficiaries. And the bottom note is from the senior construction manager that I worked with. I'd sent him a note of congratulations, and he said, I know we've constructed sustainable housing that will last. And I do think that that is what Canada wanted when people donated. And it's about making tough decisions in a difficult place, knowing that you may lose staff along the way, but that you need to stay focused in terms of the long term and what is right in that context. And so it is achievable. And I do believe we can rebuild in Haiti in the proper way, and that Haiti can create what they need in that context. This is a picture of a village that's, the landscape has changed obviously from the tsunami, so there's now water inland, but this was one of the villages that had been finished before I left. I stayed 2 years, and then the construction team in construction continued. So those are perspectives then in terms of dealing with the leadership challenge in this context. Not easy, most difficult job I've ever had in my life, but also the most rewarding job I've had in my life. Very humbled and privileged, I think, to work there. So I wanted to go to Haiti for a minute and get you to think about this question. This is what our program does. It's not about training you how to do it. It's to get people to think about the subject of disaster. So simple question, what is a disaster? So what's the disaster in Haiti? We often refer to the disaster in Haiti as the earthquake. And all that happened with the earthquake was that the ground shook. It moved a certain way. The disaster wasn't the piece of land moving. The disaster was everything that created the conditions for people to be impacted by that land moving. So pictures on the bottom are from Haiti before, pictures on the top are Haiti after. It's the environments that we build, and it's those things that create what is a disaster. So that's just a little taste of what you get if you come into the program, Master in Disaster Emergency Management program. But it gives you food for thought to think about what is a disaster and what is possible after it. And I think also food for thought about what's possible in dealing with other leadership challenges we face in our lives, very pressing problems in our lives, and what is possible. So while I come from a particular program, Royal Roads was founded on 4 pillars: leadership, sustainability, entrepreneurship, and conflict resolution. And I think you can see little bits of each of those woven throughout this presentation. So I'll leave it there to conclude, but I'm happy to take questions from you and answer any questions about either that context, disasters, or Haiti. Yes?
We have some great schools here, the School of Architecture at McGill. Dr. Avi Friedman, has he had any role to play, or can Canadian companies have more of a role to play in the actual build end of things?
Canadian companies can have a role to play, but you can't design offshore. You have to be present, you have to work with local people. I've had people phoning me since Haiti to say, what about different options? And what I say all the time is, you need to be in the context in order to do it. And it will be different solutions, and this is the challenge. It's not the same in every context. And the issues in Haiti right now, for example, are going to be around, it's the same issues about development and disaster, and how do you separate and make sense of all of that. Other questions? Yes?
In the interest of developing, hi. In the interest of developing the local economy, there were local people employed to gain revenue to buy goods.
Yes, local people are employed in a lot of different ways. The first phase of a disaster, a lot of what happens is what's called cash for work. Lots of different perspectives on that, but there's a sort of a system where people are employed to deal with the rubble and cleanup and things like that. In terms of this project, our livelihoods portion of the project was really geared to women. We had a grants program that was geared specifically to women in communities so that they made choices about what livelihood activities they felt they could undertake. Remember, the whole dynamic of the community has changed. We started off trying to use local contractors, and we awarded contracts of 40 houses to a contractor, and we had several of those contracts let. We had 5 of those contracts let initially. Each contractor that you contract with there then lets that contract to 40 people to build houses. So now you've got, I don't know how many people building houses out there, because who knows who's working on which house. Like, quality control is non-existent really in that context. And so even though we're supervising it and meeting deadlines and getting materials, there were lots of challenges. So we felt that for the size of project we had, we needed to work with construction companies that could manage that size. Built into the contract itself was that for jobs where you did not require specific skills, that they needed to hire local, they need to offer to hire locally. The other presumption behind the question is sort of who wants to build, because sometimes we say, well, people will rebuild the homes themselves. Well, did you build your own house? For the person who's a fisherman, they want to go back to fishing, right? So it's about being sensitive about that. So yes, lots of construction opportunities were made. We did bring in outside labor that had all sorts of issues that we had to manage and mitigate. Outside meaning from other parts of Indonesia, and there'd been a conflict going on. So if you said you were working in Aceh, people had a reaction to that. But I think it was a nice way to actually help to reunify the country. Yes?
Beyond the Red Cross, I'm sure there were other NGOs there. Did you work in a coordinated fashion, or who decided you were to build houses, they were to do this? How did that work? Because I hear in Haiti it's very discoordinated.
So I'm going to answer 2 things. How did we coordinate, and what do we hear about how it's coordinated? Because I think those are 2 different things. So how is it coordinated? Yes, there are systems of coordination. There is a UN system of coordination. There is the government of Indonesia working closely with the UN. There's that system. Then there's the International Red Cross system that feeded into that. And so I would go to a UN shelter meeting, for example, since we were involved in shelter, or a UN livelihoods meeting. So there was that piece. There was a mapping. At those meetings, people would talk about which communities needed assistance. How did we find those communities? I went out and knocked on doors. Somebody would give me a clue. I met the local Bapati, that's like sort of a regional official, who said, I have 3 villages that don't have anybody. It took me 2 weeks to get in to see the Bapati. I went to the 3 villages the next day. Those 3 villages didn't have anybody who were building for them. So I told them what we would offer, and they accepted that commitment. Somebody came to me and said, in Aceh Jaya on that west coast where the road was really damaged, nobody's out there. There are villages and no one is helping. I said, okay. I went out. I went to 13 villages in 2 days that had not yet had a commitment, and this was 6 months after the disaster. Because it was a hard area to work in. Everybody was grabbing all the villages that were close and easy, and I said, okay, well, I mean, our focus is on vulnerable populations, so we're going to go out there. We happen to work in some of the most difficult areas, not always the smartest choice. So you would let people know, and then within the village, once you're doing that, you're coordinating with who's doing livelihoods work and who's doing water and sanitation or what other kinds of things. So the coordination occurred both through systems and then sort of naturally on the ground. In terms of I think that the global systems for coordinating are improving, and there's lots of lessons that have been learned, and there's a cluster system now that's used with leadership and expertise in different areas. But one of the challenges is when Haiti happened, I was listening to the news every night, and I have a difficulty listening to it because the way the questions are asked is, have you seen assistance or what's going on? And it sounds like there's not a lot there. And in that first phase, people really do need to be able to look after themselves. And they are the true first responders. But if you were to go online and read the reports about the organization that was going on the ground and how they had already divided different places up into sectors and what the aid distribution points were, you'd know that was going on. So the challenge is that there's this sort of equilibrium there. Until it's going to be satisfied that people's basic needs are met, you're always going to hear people don't have everything they need. And that is to be expected. But I do believe that the machinery that sort of went into place to coordinate it moved very quickly. And again, the knowledge and the systems are there. I would say since Rwanda, there have been a lot of global initiatives specifically to change the way we do business out there. Question over here, and then back, and then back.
I just wanted to know what your career with the Red Cross, what the program did for you, because you said you had about 20 years experience before going into the program. What was it about the program or the rules that finished it off for you, or what did you gain from the program?
Well, I would say I have become and defined myself as a humanitarian based on my experience with Red Cross. And after Indonesia, it was hard to go back to my desk job that I'd had before. I needed to do something different, and that journey led me to Royal Roads. And so I was really thinking about what difference can I make by being a faculty member here versus being in the field. I can have a direct impact out there, but I can also work with people who will then themselves have a direct impact. And so for me, it's about a different journey now and having a different impact in a different way, but it's still about the same thing, and it's with the same passion. And so at the beginning of our course in disaster and emergency management, there's a session on principles, really grounded in this sense of global principles around the right way to do this work and the values that should be there.
Yeah, just taking it back to when the operations are going on the ground. I'm wondering if you find that there's a significant adverse impact on operations, just in terms of cooperation from governments and whatnot, due to that sort of cursory media attention that is more focused on, what are the, instant things, why aren't their houses up yet? Do you find that really impacts operations long term, or is it sort of just a passing effect?
I don't find that the media influences operations really. It didn't influence operations from what we were doing, or most people on the ground were doing. You're there, you're doing the job, you're trained to do a job, you know what needs to be done, and that's what you're focused on. So you can dismiss some of that other side of it in terms of that pressure. Except that when it comes to things like the first anniversary, there's a lot of pressure, and it's like, what are you going to be able to show? And there's this pressure on how to frame and show what you have done. But for the day-to-day work, I think it doesn't do it. It is a challenge at the front end when people who are well-known come into your space, because there's lots of work that it takes to ensure that they can be there, but they also need to be there. So I think it's a balance. And they can also, I think that many of the people who come in have some knowledge to be able to speak about the context.
Given the fact that most of the timber in Indonesia was illegal, did you feel under pressure to use an imported timber? And how did you feel about it? My second question is, how did you control the quality of the construction there in order to meet the earthquake resistance requirements?
So the timber issue was one of the first issues. We actually did, one of the reasons we did the value drivers, because we were having to deal with the timber dilemma. Where are we going to get our timber from, and what are we going to do? And so we did the value drivers first, and then we went through it using the timber, imported timber or local timber. One thing about the value drivers is you can't just have one person sit down and do it, because you may have different people with different expertise. Somebody's going to have more of a social expertise, somebody's going to have more of a construction expertise, and you need them both to work on that together. So it's sort of a consensual process. Not a big room full of people, but you need to have a few people, the right people, making that decision. We actually went with imported timber. We could not, there is no legal timber. And what was happening in the forests around us, they were being destroyed. You could see it everywhere. They're, by the side of the road, you can make money. People don't have money. So they can go and just take the trees down. They do it in the middle of the night. It's both the trees and the rocks as well, the quarries. So they just take the trees down, and you know what that does. And both to the environment, the habitat, as well as to human life in that context. And most of the timber comes from Kalimantan, and there's all sorts of issues over there. And so we made the choice about bringing in imported wood. You've got to bring wood in from a different place. It has to survive in that climate. You've got to do all sorts of things like that. So yes. And your second part of your question was?
About the control of the quality.
Oh, yeah. QA. So Canadian Red Cross was worried about spending money in an area of doing construction work, which is already an area that you've got to worry about money and slippage, and in a place that was ranked fourth by Transparency International in terms of corruption in the world. So they did a really smart thing. They brought in Deloitte. And so we actually, the board of governors here was trained by Deloitte, the senior management was trained by Deloitte. Deloitte came to the field, worked with us, trained all of our staff. We also worked with Ernst & Young. So Ernst & Young had to do pre-qual reviews on any contractor we worked with. We looked at everything about the company. And if the books weren't in order, we wouldn't work with them. So you could get screened out really easily that way. Then once you got in there, then you learn about how corruption works in a specific context, and it's different in different places. And so once you know where the corruption is, you do things. And what I would say is our systems here, if you use them there, would be leaky sieves. You wouldn't have a cent left. So you have supervisor over supervisor over supervisor. So we hired people who were supervisors, but then we had people who would supervise them, and then the senior management would audit that work. And I'm fairly confident that those houses are going to stand.
Through your reconstruction effort, were you able to educate people in Indonesia and so in Haiti on just potential aspect of it happening again? How prepared would they be? And would it be sustainable enough to tell this family you need to have a certain amount of water and this that will sustain you for 72 hours? Was there an educational component on that?
Yeah. So this is part of the collaborative piece, is that we're some groups that were doing more of that type of education work. We certainly did in a couple ways. One, in that land use planning when we were designing a new community. One of the things, any community we were building, we were trying to look at exit areas, so tsunami routes out. And some of the dilemmas for us was that the land was not a good spot, and we didn't think that we could either get fresh water there or people could get out of that area. And so we'd say, we won't build there. Even if the community wants it, we won't build there. So we would do that. People knew about our houses and the design. Canada's known for quality, and so they got to understand what quality was. And this is another aspect of quality control. If somebody's slipping up and sneaking something else in their house, they'll let you know about it. So they understood about raising it to a certain height. They understood some of those things. There were programs working with children, so American Red Cross and some others were doing some of those programs. We had a specific program where we put in radio towers, because again, there'd been conflict there, so you couldn't use radio as a means of communicating. And so you can have all the high-tech early warning system you want, but if you don't have a low-tech solution to get it to people, that last mile doesn't work. So we put in the last mile. And the last mile was both the infrastructure and then the training within the communities about how to disseminate that information related to tsunami warning. And so they've actually had drills and tests with that kind of thing going on. Yes?
On the disaster of this magnitude, considering the administrative framework for the QA and then that, how do you deal with the language? How does that work when the supervisor has to supervise the supervisor, and how's the coordination effort done in terms of the language?
You work in multiple languages. You produce documents in the language you need to produce them in. Some people need to be bilingual. A lot of our staff, in Aceh, there's also Acehnese, so it's not one, there is an Indonesian language that is understood not by everybody in the country, but it's a common language, but then there's also local language. So you needed to know when you needed to have somebody who could speak Acehnese versus Indonesian, and then somebody who needed to be bilingual. So our construction contracts and legal documents were all bilingual. We had a service that would do that kind of work for us, and then same with the supervision, just knowing that the engineer who's looking visually at what's being done doesn't need to necessarily have to speak. He can see what's going on. So yes, sometimes we make people tear things out.
Hi. You spoke about corruption a few times there, and I'm just curious, how did you deal with the current government? Did they actually ask for some money from you guys when you go there? And the second question is, for disaster areas like that, say in Indonesia, as in a third world country, sometimes the efforts or the relief goods that's supposed to be going to the people doesn't actually reach the people. It just being stuck with the government, and then eventually, when there's an election, that's when they release goods. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Yeah. So in terms of corruption with the government, this was a large disaster. Indonesia has poor ranking related to corruption. This was a chance for them to show the world that they've cleaned up their act. So they were cautious about who they chose to head up the reconstruction agency. Pak Kuntoro was chosen, who had a reputation of being clean and being somebody who was trying to, with those efforts. There was, it was stated that there was a zero tolerance policy about it. We had choice, there's different ways you can deal with corruption. And so the rules, my marching orders were zero tolerance. So zero tolerance means zero tolerance. If something's there and you're interacting with it, that's why I say our systems here are leaky sieves. Normal procedures don't work. So there were no pressures, there were no overt pressures from the government at all. Did it exist around you? Yes. Could you see it? Yes. I'm comfortable with every penny that we spent in terms of the value of our dollar and how we managed it. It did influence the way we would structure a contract and what we would do and not do to mitigate our risk. In terms, there's certain parts of that process that are more difficult. I can speak more from the Red Cross, but one of the things that we do is just in terms of agreeing on access, and we've stopped things in place. We've stopped deliveries. We've stopped building in communities when there have been issues, and are willing to walk in some cases. So. It was very difficult. Transparency International was working there and did some fascinating work, and we met with them. They had a very different approach. I'm not sure how you could make it work on a large scale, but they did a fascinating piece in terms of actually trying to really work with the community itself about the values and about what that change would be. I'm not sure how you can do that at a community level when the society around you is not changing. It's one of the questions I come away with is, how do we move beyond some of that?
And I think we have time for one more question. Were both questions answered, Harry and Matt? Yeah? Okay.
This is a bit of an odd question. You started off with, this is what a definition of a disaster is. It seems as a global community we're really good at responding to emergencies and the pictures that the media puts on TV. And as somebody that lived in a developing country, there's other disasters that don't make the news because they're through not necessarily conflict, but through other issues. But yet they still have just as many people, in terms of the definition of a disaster, just as many people affected, just as many deaths.
you know, you look at areas of the Sudan and different things like that, but that's not on TV every night. So is it partially that as a global community, our definition of disaster needs to change? Because we're great at giving money when something like Haiti happens. But, you know, you look at how long, you know, Haiti was ignored for years. You know, they're the second poorest nation prior to the disaster. But now they're getting the funding that they weren't able to get for years. And who's fault, you know, because I feel like we almost have a part to play in that global disaster, because it wouldn't have been the way that it is now if not for the years leading up to it previously. So I'm just wondering.
I agree. I mean, that's the point, is that, you know, the earth shook in Haiti, and the reason that we call it a disaster is because of what had happened before. That's why it's a disaster. You speak to the concept, one, of neglected disasters. There are disasters where the consequence in terms of human life is the same, but it doesn't get the attention and it doesn't get our support. And that's real. And there are many reasons why disasters are in that category of neglected disasters. There's some effort to enhance the way that donor funds are being spent and that donors are being accountable for that international humanitarian assistance side of it. And then those pictures of NIAS in terms of, you know, is it substandard housing or is it disaster, and what choices do you make? It's very difficult when you're in a context where things are substandard and you're dealing with development issues to separate that out. And I don't think you can separate it out. The challenge is that a lot of donor funds get directed to beneficiaries who've been impacted by the disaster. If the big donor funds don't allow some support to think about community as a whole, you know, we were able to do what we were able to do in NIAS because we were able to discuss with the Canadian government the dilemma that we're in, and we had our own funds that we could use in a different way to do that. But that's, you know, majority of funds that go to big disasters around the world come from the government. They don't come from you and I. What was different about the tsunami, what's different about Haiti is you have a large public contribution. Most of it comes from governments, most of it has a restriction about time, about who it goes to. And that, in and of itself, can create tension or further conflict or, you know, impede progress. But, you know, that's the kind of stuff we get to talk about in the program. So I'll conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention.